Good evening, everybody. So, hopefully you got a copy of the lesson back there. A little different format than what we've been using. This is actually a printout from the Answers in Genesis, the digital study guide. And I'd been taking a lot of that and converting it over, typing it into Faith Notes, but I'm having a lot of trouble with Faith Notes right now. I told you last week we had a little trouble with it, and I upgraded, and it's kind of a mess right now. So if you've tried to get online, I apologize, they're not on there. Hopefully this week I'll get that fixed, and maybe by next week it'll actually be, when it's all done, it'll actually be a little better than it was if you use the online one. It'll just be laid out a little bit better. Excuse me. But for right now, this week and next week, I went ahead and printed them off for you. So let's get right into this because we've got a lot to cover tonight. And I'll try to go through it relatively quick because we've got a lot of slides. But I don't want to get too quick because there's a lot here. And there's a lot in here that I'm not even including into this presentation. So it'll just kind of be a skim the surface type presentation because there's just so much there. Because I want to add in also about the Grand Canyon. So Lesson 28, the Ice Age. I told you last week, Ice Age is key to understanding post-flood. The Ice Age came in just right at the end of the flood, kind of went hand in hand, and we'll look tonight how the flood actually caused the Ice Age, and it explains it very well versus what the secular scientists believe. And so before we do that, before we get into the Ice Age, I want to talk about the flood a little bit because the Grand Canyon, because the Grand Canyon ties in also with post-flood. It kind of goes hand in hand with the Ice Age. And we've talked a little bit about it, but I wanted to look at it a little bit more to help everybody understand. So this picture, this is not the Grand Canyon. Looks a lot like just a small part of it, right? This is actually Mount St. Helens. Mount St. Helens, erupted in, was it May 28th, somewhere like that? 1980, erupted in 1980. And date myself here a little bit. I started kindergarten that year, and a couple of my classmates were there whenever that went off. And they were talking about it. I'll never forget that when they came back. Of course, didn't mean that much to me then. I thought, well, that's cool, and kind of forgot about it for a long time. But then when I really started studying the Bible and started studying about the flood and the Grand Canyon and everything else, Mount St. Helens really stood out to me. Because this canyon right here, there's several canyons like it. It's 1/40th the size of Grand Canyon. 1/40th. It's a 1/40th scale model. Looks a lot like it. This is a color picture that kind of helps you see the layers there a little bit. If you've ever been to Grand Canyon, I've got some pictures here that will see those layers, those sedimentary layers. The interesting thing about that canyon, that picture I just showed you, and I'll have it again in the slide here in a little bit. That canyon, if you went back and you didn't, say it happened a long time ago, it didn't happen in 1980, say it happened a few hundred years ago or even 1,000 years ago, people would look at that canyon and what would they say? That little bitty branch that flows through the bottom of it, they would say what? That it took probably, 1 million years for that to carve that down to that far, right? But actually that canyon in this picture that you're seeing right here was made overnight. Overnight. So as Mount St. Helens erupted, May 18th, I've got it here on my slide, May 18th, 1980. This is what Mount St. Helens looked like before it erupted. Beautiful mountain, snow-covered. Of course, it's a volcano, obviously, but it would have been dormant for a long time. But that snow kind of plays into it because when it erupted, it blew off the whole side of the mountain. This is what it looks like today. You see that huge crater that's taken out of it. It blew the snow off as it erupted. Not only did you have the ash and the aerosols going up in the air, the lava flowing, but it caused all that ice to be blown off the mountain. That ice landed down on the ground and dirt piled up on top of it, and then it exploded. A lot of that exploded. But that canyon that we saw there, and you can see some small aspects of it here, different ones. That's not the exact one in the picture, but it's similar. some of those were caused kind of immediately as that topography. This was all forest. If you remember that previous picture, this was all lush forest. It wiped the trees out. Spirit Lake, it filled it full of trees. It caused a major dam. It backed up, caused a lot of flooding. And that flooding, and that flow and everything, and the melting of all that ice, it created these huge ice dams and dirt dams that gave way. And overnight, we saw the carving of that canyon there very quickly. This is several hundred feet of sediment that was laid down within just hours of that erupting. It erupted in 1980, and then a few times after that, 1982 is the latest. That picture was taken in 1982. Here's another picture here of another part of it. And then here's Grand Canyon. Again, very similar. Again, this is a larger scale, but you can see on this side of the picture, you see the layers there. Here's another picture, right? More layers. And so we look at the Grand Canyon, right? And the scientists say that it took millions and millions of years to carve that canyon. It took millions and millions of years of before it was carved, of laying down those layers. And if you go through the geologic column and they start dating all those layers, there's millions of years, right? Or hundreds of millions of years built up in those layers. They say each one of those represents a different time, and they date the fossils and stuff according to that. The only place that the geologic column is found is in textbooks. It's the only place it's found in the whole world. It's just a man's try to dismiss everything else. The thing about Grand Canyon, you have all those layers, but there's zero erosion between the layers. Zero. And if it was millions of years between those layers, you would have erosion, right? The layers would be like this instead of perfectly flat. They can't explain that. But those layers were laid down at the flood. All right? So those are all sedimentary layers. And as the flood churns everything else up, right, all around the whole world, everything's silt and everything's stirred up, shifted around, moved around, huge underwater landslides, different things. As it begins to settle out towards the end of the flood, you do a simple kids experiment. Take you a jar and put dirt in it and gravel in it and rocks in it. What happens? And some water. You shake that up, you set it down. Within minutes, what happens? You have layers, right? It automatically just settles out in layers. And that's what we see post-flood. We see all these sedimentary layers. Now, those are dirt, right? That's sediment as it's laid down. It's soft. But over time, it hardens into rock. So now you have limestone and you have sandstone layers. This is all rock now. It's not eroding like it did at the time of the flood when it was soft. Also, in the Grand Canyon and many other places in the world, remember as the mountains rose up at the end of the flood, all the mountain ranges around the world began to rise up. You have the plate tectonics and the shifting. You have an interesting phenomenon that happens. And like I said, in some of the barbed canyons off of the side of the Grand Canyon and other places in the world, they find rock layers that are bent. They're curved. And they're not fractured. So the only way that could possibly happen is how? Those rock layers were bent while they were still soft. So after the flood, as that sediment settles out, as the mountains rose up, as the Bible says the mountains rose up at the end of the flood, those soft layers rose up and flexed. If you try to bend rock, what happens? It breaks, it shatters, right? But these rock layers are curved with no fractures in them at all. And so secular, right, non-God-believing people want to explain those and saying that some kind of heat source heated that rock. It was already rock, but somehow it was heated up and made it pliable and allowed it to bend as the mountains rose up. You'll hear that theory, but that doesn't make sense at all. It rose up during the flood, and so at the end of the flood. And so here's a drawing picture of all those different layers, right? There's some problems, right, with, again, going back to their philosophy that all those represent different millions of years. The problem you find is there in Grand Canyon and many other places in the world, you find what? Marine fossils. Marine fossils laid down in those sedimentary layers, right? Why? Because when the fountains of the deep broke open, right, all those animals got killed and stirred up, right? Many survived, but many died, right? Majority of them died because of the excessive heat of the fountains coming up, the hot springs. And that's why you find diatomaceous earth, beds of diatomaceous earth, different places. You probably use diatomaceous earth. They use it in oil dry. That's what oil dry is most of the time, is diatomaceous earth. Use it in pool filters, other places. The interesting thing, again, secular scientists say it takes like 1 million years for an inch of diatomaceous earth, yet they have pits of it just hundreds of feet deep of diatomaceous earth that was laid down when? During the flood, right? As it burst up, killed the animals. And so these marine fossils have been scattered all over the world, right? Even on Mount Everest, there's marine fossils. There's clams, petrified clams that have been found because that was laid down, and then those mountains rose up. Not that the water covered Mount Everest. It wasn't there, right? It rose up afterward. The Rocky Mountains, even the Ozark Mountains, all that rose up at the end of the flood. Another problem with their theory, this is a petrified tree going through what? All those layers, right? How does a tree not rot while millions of years are happening for those layers to be laid down? You find petrified trees standing up like this all over the world, going through hundreds of millions of years worth of layers. Again, they can't explain that at all. And so going back to the layers, this is north of the Grand Canyon. You get up around Bryce Canyon and many other places, or really anywhere out west. You see some of those same layers, right? You see signs of massive erosion. You look at that rising up there, but you look at this plain here. You get out west, and it's amazing how much erosion, a place where it doesn't rain very much at all, right? You have massive amounts of erosion. Even around here, we don't have to go very far. We can go just down the road here to Kings River. You know, we like to float, right? And you love the big bluffs and stuff. You think about how those bluffs gets there. What's usually opposite of that bluff? A lot of times it's a big old huge bottom, right? And you know that water didn't get deep enough to flood that bottom that deep. I mean, relatively, sometimes it gets a little bit, but not to erode those big bluffs and stuff. That happened from a massive amount of water over a short time. Even around here, you go off and you find huge rocks where there's a lot of erosion that's taking place, where not very much water runs now. It's not that it took millions of years for that to erode that down, as the secular scientists say. It happened very quickly as the flood waters are receding after the flood. It's massive erosion, this area and every other area in the world. So we see signs of massive erosion, and that's what Grand Canyon is. Grand Canyon is just massive erosion done very quickly. So did it take a little water over a lot of time, as they want to say, or was it a lot of water over a little bit of time? It was a lot of water over a little bit of time that carved the Grand Canyon out. I can't say exactly how long it took to carve the Grand Canyon, but think about that one there in Mount St. Helens that did it overnight. While everybody's sleeping, they wake up the next day and here's this huge canyon. And I think it was probably very similar with the Grand Canyon. Maybe it took weeks for all that water to drain all the way through, but I don't think much more than that. Weeks, I might even give you months. But now over time, right, it's slowly eroded some off of the sides and stuff from what little rain that happens out in that area. But the major part of this was caused as that quickly went out. Basically, Grand Canyon is a breached dam. If you've ever seen a pond overflow and wash out very quickly, that's what Grand Canyon is. If you go up above Grand Canyon, you really cover this 4-state area, and you see it outlined there, and I'll fill it in there. There's signs of a huge lake. That whole area, at some point, right after the flood, was a huge lake. And you look at many places around out west, these huge lakes, and I'll have a few other slides. So you picture filling in that whole basin, and somebody named it Grand Lake. You know, it's just kind of a name that was thrown at it. But right here where I put this red arrow, that right there is the start of Grand Canyon. And so it flows through all the way out through that direction. And so as that breached, it started eating through that soft sediment that hadn't hardened into rock yet, and just probably over a matter of days or weeks, it carved out the Grand Canyon. Very simple explanation. But you don't want, the secular don't want to accept that because they don't want to accept the fact that there was a flood, right? It makes complete sense. It makes better sense than anything that they've ever come up with. But if you look at it from the biblical viewpoint, the biblical world view, through the glasses of the Bible, it's very self-explanatory. Around here, it's self-explanatory. I see signs of the flood pretty much everywhere I go. And it's just amazing to look at that. Here's another. This is called the Great Basin, again, out west. You see Great Salt Lake kind of up there in the upper corner of the picture there. But that whole area, right, is a basin that drains out. And if you look around the Great Salt Lake is a lot smaller than it used to be. You have what's called Lake Bonneville. You have the Bonneville Salt Flats where they do the speed racing and stuff, right? That's all in this, what used to be Lake Bonneville. It's just barren, dry desert area now. But there's signs you can see the shoreline that used to be there. Again, this is all right after the flood, post-flood. You see Lake Missoula a little farther up into the northern Montana, into Canada. You see a lot of these lakes that were caused by glaciers even that have eroded away now, right? They've breached just like Grand Canyon did. Not on the massive scale, but on the small scale. Side note, I don't have any pictures of it, but they found one of these on Mars. They found a Grand Canyon on Mars that's bigger than the one on Earth. And you know what their determination was? That water caused that very quickly. There's no water on Mars. But they say that water carved that canyon out very quickly. It was a breached dam, but they want to say that for Mars, but they won't accept it on Earth where there is water, but they accept it for Mars where there isn't. So there's a problem there. But all these layers, of course, they've all got names, right? But the interesting thing, you have sandstone, you have shale, you have limestone. Again, going back to that kids experiment, right? Take your jar, shake it up, it's going to settle out. And so will the fossils. The fossils will settle out in different layers depending on how they got killed, weight, and different things, right? Some things float a little longer than other things. It's not so sorted out by the age of the fossil. Again, they date the age of the rock by the fossils they find in it. They date the fossils by the age of the rock they find it in. It's circular reasoning. But it was all done exactly about 4,400 years ago, right? At the time of the flood was when it all happened at the same time. But these layers, again, if you can kind of see the outline of the United States, these same layers that are found there at Grand Canyon, right? You find them all over. Here's one layer, and I'll go through these very quickly. Another layer, another layer, another layer. You see how these different layers are laid out there? And so you not only find it on the United States, you find those worldwide. Why? Because they were laid down at the exact same time, at the flood, right? As it laid down all these sedimentary layers. So now let's get to the Ice Age. That was just a quick run through on the Grand Canyon. There's a lot more that we could talk about there, but that kind of gives you the idea, I think. All right, so how many ice ages have there been, right? That's a question we're going to cover tonight. A couple of verses here. Most of tonight's lesson really not going to tie into Scripture, right? But it ties into the timeline of post-flood. You're going to put Job. You're going to put Job in this period. You're going to put Job kind of in that Ice Age period. You're going to put the Tower of Babel during that Ice Age period. You're going to put Abraham coming in towards the end of it. We don't know exactly how long it lasted, but there's a lot of things that we see in the Bible that take place during this time, but it's not necessarily specified. There is some references in Job to the snow, right? But that's really about all there is. But Genesis 8, chapter 8, just to have a little scripture in here, 20 through 22. Again, we've looked at these verses before, but this is what come along with this lesson, so I went ahead and put them in here. And Noah built an altar unto the Lord and took of every clean beast and of every clean fowl and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And the Lord smelled a sweet savor, and the Lord said in his heart, I will not again curse the ground any more for man's sake. For the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth, neither will I again smite any more everything living as I have done. While the earth remaineth, this is a key verse right here. While the earth remaineth, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease, right? God promised that. But we're going to see, it doesn't say the temperatures of those summer and winter, right? And we're going to look at that. But the seasons are going to exist as long as God allows this earth to exist here. We have this definition of uniformity, right? God's creation follows laws that allow us to perform scientific inquiry, right? There's certain things like gravity is a constant, right? We have laws that are established down. So if everything else is evolving, the big question is, why are the laws not evolving too, right? Those laws, you don't change those, right? Gravity doesn't change. It's a constant, right? It's not like one day you could jump out this window and float up in the air, and the next day you're going to fall like a rock. You're going to fall like a rock every day you jump out there, from now till God returns, right? And so it's just how it is. But that is also a bad word too, because you have uniformitarianism is kind of the religion of secular scientists. Uniformitarianism, and we have to be careful not to fall into this mindset of our own, that uniformitarianism says the things that are happening now is how things have always happened. And that's not the case. Now, granted, yes, we have uniformity in the fact that God said there's going to be summer and winter, right? There's going to be the seasons. All that is uniform, right? But what we see out in nature doesn't necessarily mean that's how it's always been. Again, looking pre-flood, a lot different atmosphere. Everything was different before then. Post-flood, very different. Now, things started looking a lot like they do now, but there have been changes, right? And then one of those changes is the Ice Age, and let's talk more on that. So this picture here is a glacier. Now, there's glaciers still in the world today, but they're disappearing at a rapid rate, right? Now you see it, now you don't. You see within about 100 years of this picture, this is how far this is melted back. And there's other places where it's melted back a lot farther. This picture here is a picture we took the year before last. This is at the Glacier National Park there in Montana. We had to hike about 8 miles to take this picture. It was a rough hike, very steep. But up on that's the edge of the glacier, right? And if you get up on the top of that rock, the glacier is more behind it. Of course, it used to be right there. And you see this gravel and this rock here. I'm going to talk about moraines here in a little while. That's a moraine right there. And from right here, and I'll show you a next picture here, but there's this lake here, super cold, right? Frigid. Got icebergs floating in there. Most of the year, that's frozen. It just thaws for a little while in July and August. This is middle of August when we're there. It's still cold, but it's at least the surface is not totally frozen here, but yet you have the icebergs. But this drops down. There's a waterfall right behind where I'm taking the picture here, just a little bit. And you'll see that waterfall here in the next picture. And there's a waterfall up on that upper side of that picture coming down. But this glacier is moving back. Now, you go back about 100 years, you wouldn't have had to hike 8 miles. Well, actually, we took a boat for part of it and then hiked the rest of it, because there's several of these lakes that have been left behind by the glacier melt. When they first came to this part of the park, the glacier was right there by the lodge, and it's melted all the way back. And so here's another picture. This is a couple miles away from it. This is Glacier Lake here. Again, keep stepping down. You see that waterfall. Where you see the top of that waterfall, that's where that first picture was taken, right below where that snow is. And so that glacier is melting back very rapidly. But we see during the Ice Age, the glaciers came way down. And they determined that really as far as our area, about Kansas City is as far as the glaciers came. And you can tell that by things like this. So as a glacier is building with the heavy snow, glaciers move, right? So as they're building, they're moving forward. And so they take rocks and stuff and they gouge the solid rock like this. And so you can tell where glaciers have been because you find these scratch marks basically in the solid rock. You find things like this. These are called erratics. This is out in the middle. You can see that's just a huge flat area, and that's a rock that's not native to that area. That rock has been carried hundreds of miles to that point. That rock came from hundreds of miles up north. Here's another one to give you an example. This is a huge granite boulder. Look at the size of that thing, right? It's sitting on top of some limestone here. That was carried by glaciers, pushing it forward like a bulldozer. And so that's how we can kind of determine, right, exactly how far the Ice Age came in a certain area by finding erratics, by finding moraines, and by finding the scratch marks. And so we kind of get an idea of how far down it came. And again, about Kansas City is as far as it came down in our area. Now, the interesting thing, we'll talk more on this in a little bit, don't think, oh, it started at the Arctic and it come down. No, the Arctic might have been tropical at that point. Does that make sense? And I'll explain it to you here in a little bit. So don't think, oh, it started at the north and come down. No, different areas had ice on them. Some didn't had ice. Some had lush vegetation. And I'll explain that here in a minute. Here's another picture of a glacier that has receded all the way back. You can see, if you can see that channel there, you find these U-shaped. But here is a lateral moraine. Lateral moraines are on the side. As it's pushing down, it pushes this gravel to the side. That's lateral, right? Lateral. And then at the end, where the point where it stops and begins to recede, that's called a terminal moraine. It looks like this, but it's right at the end, right? It stops, it terminates. And all through, as it begins to recede, right? If it's been heavy, instead of just having an erratic, you find what's called glacial till, which is like chunked up gravel and stuff as it carried that down and carried a large amount of it. So you can tell the heavier the glacial till, the heavier and thicker the ice was. And I'm talking thousands of foot of ice. I'm not talking like 6 foot deep of ice. I'm talking thousands of foot of ice. And that's why we still have it today, right? The glaciers are disappearing, and oh no, it's global warming. No, those are still melting from the flood, right? So they've been melting for over 4,000 years, right? But they came a long ways, and now they're starting to go back. So what causes an ice age? And again, I borrowed a lot of these slides from Answers in Genesis on a different program, not through this that we're doing here with the Sunday school. It says, what causes an ice age? So, again, glacial ice sheets require these 4 different ingredients. You have to have warm oceans, cold continents, mild, not super cold, mild wet winters. Because you think about this. When do we get our heaviest snows here? March and April, right? That's when you can get a 24-inch snow, right? We haven't had one in quite a few years, but you can have a 24-inch snow in this area. It ain't going to last very long. But your heaviest, wettest snow is usually when it's a little bit warmer. It's not when it's super cold. Like when it gets blows, you don't have much snow because there's not much moisture. So you need mild winters, mild and super wet winters, and you need cool summers, right? Because you don't want a hot summer that's going to melt the snow back, right? Like it does, It snows here and it melts away, even up north, right? It snows and then eventually it melts away. It may not be gone for very long the farther north you get, but it goes away because you have a warm summer. So you need all those things for that ice to continue to build up. So it's going to build up year after year after year, right? So we don't know exactly how long the ice age lasted. Some speculate it might have lasted 500 to 600 years. It might have just been a few hundred years. We have no idea knowing. They kind of try to calculate, but they don't know. But we do know that it was here and we know it happened, right? And this is what it takes to cause it. Now, when the secular scientists try to generate and explain an ice age, they can't come up with this. They can't explain. Now, they say we're due for another ice age. One's coming, but they can't explain what caused it. What was the mechanism that triggered it? And so, how do you get those things that we saw on the other slide? So, one of the things, volcanic activity warms the ocean. Also, what broke open? The fountains of the deep, right? The hot springs. Still today, right? You can go. There's springs all over the ocean. And the book of Job talks about that, doesn't it? Long before anybody ever realized there were springs in the ocean, God asked Job about that. God mentioned it to Job, right? About the springs in the ocean. Long before man discovered them for himself. But there's hot springs that pop up. There's hot springs even here in Arkansas, right? And you have hot springs under the ocean. You have hot springs on the ground. But when the fountains of the deep broke open, that wasn't cold water, right? That was hot water. And so it would have warmed the oceans, right? Just the effect of the rain, right? It's called latent heat. It actually creates heat. And so you would have had a warmer ocean than what you have today. And so a warmer ocean releases more water vapor, right? And that's why you go around the equator, right? And that's where you have your tropical forest today, right? In the hottest part of the world, right? Because the water's warm and it picks up that moisture and dumps it on the land in a higher volume. That's where most of our hurricanes start from, is that warm water around the equator, right? Because the warm water allows more moisture, more evaporation to be picked up. And again, if you have a warmer ocean, and I'm talking worldwide, right? I mentioned the Arctic Ocean there a while ago. Arctic Ocean would have been right in that same boat. Again, they don't know. They kind of speculate, maybe 80-something degrees for an ocean. Today, the average water temperature in the ocean is like 30-something degrees. So you got to factor the whole thing in, right? It averages out to 30-something, under 40 degrees. But we're talking like an average of like 86 degrees roughly. Again, that's just guess. But you have a warmer, say it is 86. So the difference between, say, 30-something degree water and 80-something degree water is about 7 to 8 times evaporation. So you're going to pick up 7 or 8 times more moisture and dump it onto the land. All right? So next, you have heavy snowfall on the cold continents, the cooler continents, you really should say, right? So as it picks it up out of the warm ocean, takes it over a cooler continent, right? And then it dumps in heavy snow. Think about what we see modern day. Lake effect snow is a perfect example of this. So in the winter, right, you go up to the Great Lakes, and if it cools off, right, a cold front comes through, before the water temperatures cool off in the Great Lakes, what happens? Lake effect snow. Because you have a warmer water, and it picks that moisture up, and then it dumps it over the cool continent, right? Buffalo, New York being one of those. It's nothing, it's not out of the question to get 6 foot of snow in one snowfall there from a lake effect snow. It's nothing at all. One little snowfall, 6 foot. We see it, I mean, it happened this year, it happens about every year to some degree. And so that's that same effect globally, right? Globally. And so it's going to pick that up. But how do we get those cool continents, right? If the waters are warmer, how do we get the cool continents? Volcanic activity. So you have volcanic aerosols block light and prevent melting. So you have the ash and you have the aerosols that are picked up from a volcano, and they get up in the atmosphere and they block out the rays, right? They block out the sun. It's kind of like a greenhouse effect, right? It blocks everything out, reflects the UV rays back. It causes the air temperature to be cooler. Not super frigid, right? Because you need mild temperatures, but it cools everything off. We still see that today, right? Areas where you have volcanic activity, it causes a cooling. Has anybody ever heard of 1816? The summer or the year without summer? You heard 1816? So 1816, Mount Tambora, actually in 1815 is when it erupted, but it caused the effect into 16. So Mount Tambora in Indonesia erupted. Indonesia. And it caused no summer in the northern hemisphere, America, Europe, that area. People died because their crops failed. Because the aerosols and the ash caused cooler temperatures and the crops wouldn't grow. The sunlight couldn't get to them. And so their crops failed. And so we see that on a small scale. That was one volcano. And that's one volcano. Just a little over 100 years ago, we see that, or 200 years ago, we see that representation of that, right? But picture, right? Think about post-flood. What's happening? The mountains are rising up, right? Things are shifting around. What's happening? Is it one volcano, two volcanoes? No, it's probably hundreds of volcanoes going off, right? All over the world. Right here in Arkansas, Crater, right? Crater Diamonds, right? Down in Murfreesboro. That's a volcano here in Arkansas. All over the world, we find these dormant volcanoes that haven't went off in forever, 4,000 years, a lot of them, right? Some are still going off today. Mount St. Helens, 1980. One just went off here a couple of days ago. I can't remember where it was. But we still have volcanic activity, but it's one here, one there kind of thing. But right after the flood, when everything's really moving around, really going off, you've got multiple volcanoes going off. Heavy ash, right? Heavy aerosols in the air. And not only over a year period, right? This is going to happen for a long time. Now, gradually, it's going to decrease. Year by year, it's going to get less and less. And that's what we still see today, right? We see less and less earthquakes. We see less and less volcanic activity than we even did. I think everything's kind of equalizing a little bit. But, we still have that going on today, but it would have been a higher volume at this point. And so over time, again, those snow layers form into glaciers as that snow is dumping over those cooler continents. And we're going to see that not everything is covered, and we'll look at that here in a little bit. So what causes an ice age? Again, only thing that really explains that is the flood. So we have to have glacial ice sheets, require 4 ingredients, right? Warm oceans, cold continents, mild wet winters, and cool summers. So the flood model, right, we have warm oceans, I just talked about it, cooler continents, cold continents, and mild wet winters and cool summers, all as a result of post-flood. But secular view has that we've had about 4 major ice ages through the years. They said the nearest one was about a little less than 10,000 years ago. They're pretty close, right? The last one was about 4,000 years ago. But they're not too bad on their model. Why? Because the evidence shows that. What they're wrong in is the fact that there was more before that. Again, they're going back millions of years, right? Or hundreds of thousands of years going back. But there was one ice age. Again, it can't happen before the flood, can't happen pre-flood because everything was probably a temperate climate then. But it would happen right after the flood. Are we doing another one? No. I don't see that unless God wants to make it happen. I don't see it happening. It's not spoken about in Scripture. I don't think we're doing another one. I don't think we have to worry about it. And the scientists that say we're doing another one, again, they can't trigger it. They can't figure it out because their models that they create don't match up with what we see the evidence of where these glaciers are. And I'll talk about that here in a second here on this next slide. So the biblical view, one ice age right after the flood. Secular, multiple ice ages, although they do agree there was one in recent history. So right after the flood, you have grasslands in Siberia, right? So as I said, the Arctic Ocean would have been warm like all the other water bodies of the world. And so you have this onshore flow, right, off of this warm water, dumping torrential rains on the coastland, right? You look at Seattle, right, you get a whole lot of rain there, right? And then on farther inland in the mountains, it turns into snow. But it had been a very similar model here. So most of your coastal areas are not ice covered, and that's what we see when we look at the evidence of where these glaciers were. And so you have these areas that would have been heavily, a lot of moisture, right? Mild climates. What is that prime for? It's prime for vegetation growth, right? And we see that. We see evidences. Grassland in Siberia, right? And so you see, again, these corridors that open up. So how does this tie in? Well, it's like, what does this got to do with what we're talking about with post-flood? So you have this ice age, and you have areas, Siberia, parts of Alaska, that are vegetation. They're not covered with ice. Now later on, as things begin to change, they start covering with ice. But at the beginning, again, you've got the warm oceans, right? But as the oceans begin to cool, more ice begins to form, as we see more today. But with the warm oceans, you have these beltways. What happens? If you're taking huge amounts of evaporation out of the ocean and you're depositing it as snow and it's building up thousands of feet deep on the continents, what's going to happen to the ocean? It's going to go down, right? It's going to lower. And if you lower the ocean just a little bit, you connect most all the continents, right? You could walk from Alaska to Siberia. You could walk from Canada to Greenland to Iceland to England to Europe. You could walk from Vietnam almost to Australia. Just a little bit. There's shallow areas all over. And remember, this is in the time, and we'll talk more on the Tower of Babel as these people groups spread out. What do we find all over the world? And I watch a program called Expedition Unknown. You ever heard of that? It's a really interesting program. He's not Christian-based at all, and he gets off on some things sometimes. But very interesting, that and some other things. Where do we find all over the world? We find cities underwater. We find cities underwater all over, everywhere. There's cities just off the coast. Several down around Mexico into the Gulf, down like Cancun, Cozumel, that whole area. There's several offshore cities buried in the water. The legend of Atlantis. Offshore of Africa, there's numerous offshore India. There's everywhere. Offshore Japan. There's cities just buried under the water. Now, did they build those cities underwater? No. Where did they build those cities? On the coast. Well, what happened? The water was lower, right? And that's what we're even seeing today, right? They're talking about, global warming is causing the ice to melt and it's raising the water level. To a small amount, based on what happened, right? When you're melting thousands of miles of feet of snow, right? You get a lot of rising. So that lowers it down. So that allows the people, Tower of Babel, again to spread out. It allows what? It allows the animals to spread out. After the ark landed, it allows the animals to prosper, right? You have these lush areas. And so even you see under the Sahara Desert, there's vegetation they find. When we went out to Glacier, we went through Arizona. There's a petrified forest out there in the middle of the desert. Trees petrified in the middle of the desert. Why? Because during this time period, That was lush area. Now it's desert, right? Underneath Antarctica, they find vegetation. Underneath the Arctic Circle, as they drill down for oil, they drill into vegetation. They drill into trees. There ain't no trees up in the Arctic Circle, or up in the higher part of the Arctic Circle. There is some in the Arctic Circle, but the higher up you get, there's none. They drill through trees. Why? Because at those points, at this time period right here, that was lush vegetation, right? And then as things began to change, then it turned into what we see today. And so we see that, again, that warm ocean air kept the coastal areas from forming glaciers. Again, allowed large herds of animals, allowed them to thrive. We'll talk a little bit here in a minute about the mammoths. So the Ice Age climate, right? So the Ice Age is a transitional climate, right? So you have pre-flood, you have the flood, you have the Ice Age, and then that's that transition to what we see today, right? It's not global warming, it's acclimating. It's acclimating back, okay? Yeah, granted, we are ruining our environment. I don't disagree with that. But it's not all due to aerosols, right? It's due to just how things are changing back. And so, again, they've modeled these different green areas, right? And looked at where this vegetation was. Like I said, the Sahara Desert, Siberia was lush, Antarctica. Again, I mentioned the petrified Arizona and other places that are desert now that used to have lush vegetation. So at the end of the Ice Age, as the Ice Age is wrapping up and things are really starting to acclimate back, right? So as the volcanic ash begins to clear, what happens? Things start to warm up, right? The ocean's cooling down, right? The ocean's cooling down just from evaporation. It's cooling off over time. It's cooling down. The aerosols are clearing out of the air. The ash is clearing out of the air. And as things begin to go back to kind of more to like what they are today. And so you see a transition, right? The precipitation decreases. And so these places that have lush vegetation, they go away, right? And they begin to disappear. And you have a switch over, right? And so, again, out west where we find signs of all kinds of things, animals, signs that had been there where it's in the desert, you take this lush vegetation and you turn it into something like this. This is White Sands, New Mexico, where they find all kinds of animals buried in underneath this. All kinds of skeletal remains buried under the desert. Why? Because that was lush vegetation at one point. But as it changes, right, you have areas become, the precipitation goes away and they die off and they become deserts. And we still see that today. I talked some time back about the Sahara Desert. It's growing, right? And it's expanding because as that hot air blows across, it kills the vegetation, right? And then it begins to move that desert. And they estimated the age of the desert, Sahara Desert, to be what? About 4,000 years. The coral reefs, they estimate to be about 4,000 years. Oldest tree in the world, about 4,000 years. Everything's about 4,000 years. What makes sense with that? What's it been? About 4,400 years after the flood, right? And so it just makes sense that everything would be less than that time period, and it does. Everything fits perfect with the Bible. It does not contradict. So again, I mentioned the mammoths. This is the Berezovka mammoth. This is Siberia. This is just one example, right? So they find these mammoths all over, right? Siberia, Canada, Alaska. And interesting thing about this, they find them like this, standing up, well preserved and standing up. And so, again, they're in Siberia. You have grassland. They find these with signs of buttercups and things in their mouth. They were buried with this in their mouth, right? Skin preserved, hair, flesh intact. I mean, wonderfully preserved, mummified. You can even see the vegetation that's still in their mouth, right? They died in an upright position. This one here had a broken leg and ribs. You find many times with broken legs. Sometimes broken hips, broken ribs. They died from asphyxiation. Now, how do you explain the mammoths? That's a huge thing, right? Everybody's like, oh, well, these died out millions of years ago, right? They were buried. These aren't buried, right? You see what that bottom part says? They're not buried in ice. They're buried in wind-blown sediment. They're buried in dust. That's what they're buried in. They suffocated. They were buried alive in dust, silt. And we see all over the world, we see signs of huge deposits of this silt. So again, this is just the theory, right? as the ice age is coming to an end and things are changing back, right? The ocean's cooling down, less precipitation, you start seeing drying area. You're going to have a lot of vegetation in areas that were lush, they're going to dry out. And you're going to have these massive storms, far greater than we have now. Think about the Dust Bowl of the 30s, in Oklahoma especially. Massive dust storms, right? We still have dust storms out west. But massive, even greater scale than we have today. And so that's the theory on these. That they're walking along, right? And they're going, and as the vegetation is dying out, they're trying to find more, right? They're just following. As the glaciers are melting back, and they find many of these mammoths on glacial till. They're on top of it, buried in dust. And so here's a theory, right? So they're out there in the field, right? And the wind storm comes, right? What are they going to do? They're going to turn their back to it, right? And they're going to stand there and hunker down for the storm to pass. But they get buried in this dust. And as the dust begins to build up around them, some of them try to what? Step out of it, right? And to the point that they're trying to wrestle. If you've ever been stuck in the mud, you can't get out sometimes. And that's where they would have been at. And that's where you find the broken legs. Actually breaking it from their own strength, trying to get out. This is, again, just theory. And so they would have been buried, right? And then becomes permafrost. That's what they're found in today. So permafrost is ground that is permanently frozen. So it's dust that's blown in, and then water has saturated that, and it freezes from the top down very quickly. And it doesn't thaw out today. If you've ever studied the Alcan Highway, when they built the highway to Alaska, they struggled with the permafrost. Why? Because the top part will thaw out. It never thaws out down below, but the top part will thaw out. And they had a terrible time building that road up there. Very interesting thing if you want to study on that about permafrost. But that's where they find these. They're not buried in ice. A lot of people think they're buried in ice. They're buried in dirt, wind-blown dirt, sediments, silt. And it's frozen, it stays frozen. That's how it keeps them preserved for so long. And so here's a rendition, and that's kind of small. So here's a smaller picture, right? So again, it begins to cover them up, right? And then here's a picture from the Dust Bowl, burying a house, right? So it's not unheard of, right? So how do you get fractured backbones and things like that? Well, it could be from them fighting to get out, or it could be the fact, one theory is permafrost shifts, and so they're frozen, and then that ground shifts, and that causes some of these fractures. Could it be all of them caused by that? Probably the leg bones and stuff were caused by them trying to get out. So how do you tie that, right? So we see that at the end of the flood, right? They're buried in that. And again, we think mammoths. We think of the movie Ice Age, right? They probably didn't like ice at all, right? They're in grasslands. They're not walking around in the snow. They're in grass. They're out there like cattle grazing in the grass. Again, but then as things change, they begin to get buried. So where does the conflict come in between man, the secular view, and the biblical view? Again, it comes into that dating, right? How do they put all those ice ages in there? Because they date the layers of ice that we still see today to hundreds of thousands of years instead of 4,000 years. So we look at all the ice we have today that's created in the last 4,000 years roughly, 4,400 years. They say it goes back to hundreds of thousands of years. Where do they come up with that? Ice core drilling. Have you ever heard of ice core drilling? So one of those great government projects, right? They go to different places, Antarctica, Greenland, different places, Canada, Arctic, and they drill these ice cores. They take these huge samples, right, this core bit, and they drill down thousands and thousands of feet, a couple of miles sometimes, and they pull these samples out, and they take it to a storage facility, and they label it, right? It comes out in different chunks, like 8 to 10 foot long, and they put them in these tubes, and then they slide them out, and they study them. And so you see in this picture, you see light, dark, right? All down through there. And so they go through there and they look at that and they go, okay, there's 200 rings in this sample, right? Well, that's 200 years, that one sample. That's 8 foot long. That's 200 years. And that's how they come up with it. And they go, okay, well, we drilled this far, and they calculate up the number of rings. And they say, okay, this sample is how many thousand years old, right? Hundreds of thousands of years old. The problem is those aren't annual rings, right? Those are hot periods and cool periods, or different snowfall periods. Warm, cold, right? And so you can have a lot of those in a short amount of time. And the way you disprove it, and they won't still accept it, but it's been disproved back in the 90s. Have you ever heard of the Lost Squadron? And I've taught this to the kids at the school. It's very interesting. I wish I had the time tonight to go through study on this. It's wonderful. So in 1942, this Lost Squadron, or this squadron, not lost, it wasn't lost at that time, this squadron of, I believe it was 8 P-38s and 2 B-17 bombers. They left the United States, and they made their way up through Canada, crossed Greenland. They were on their way to Iceland. They were heading over to Europe to fight. And they were making their way, and over the ocean there, before they got to Iceland, they hit a huge storm, and they had to turn back. They didn't have enough fuel because they were going to refuel at Iceland. They didn't have enough fuel to get back to any of the bases there in Greenland. So they had to make a decision to set these down on the ice there in Greenland. So these guys set these planes down and skidded them in on the ice. Now, the interesting thing, these guys are teenagers, really. I mean, you think about it. They're 17, 18, 19 years old, and they're doing this. They all survived. Every one of them survived. They made it out. They hiked their way out and made it to safety. So anyways, they took off, and this map gets a little blurry, but they began to fly up to Greenland, and then they circled back, and they sat down. Here's a picture of one of the planes. That's a P-38 that they set down straight down on the ice. Here's a picture of some of the crew. So that was 1942. In the early 80s, somebody got the great idea, hey, let's go get those planes. And their theory was, we'll go up there, we'll dust the snow off of them, we'll put fresh fuel in them, and we'll fly them off the ice. Well, they went up there, and they circled and circled and circled, and they couldn't find the planes anywhere. Now, the B-17s, they had a tail fin that stuck up over 20 feet. And they thought, surely, even if the snow's blowing, right, they're gonna see that tail fin stick up. Couldn't find nothing. So, as the years went on, they went back and went back. They finally went back with ground-penetrating radar, GPR. And they began to search, and they located those planes. They'd been there for 50 years. 1992 is when they went down to find one. They were under 263 feet of ice. 263 feet in 50 years. And so a millionaire from Middleborough, Kentucky, and the plane's still over there today, as far as I know. They fly it around, but it's headquartered there in Middleborough. He funded this project. They went up there, and they melted a tunnel down through the ice. And they melted down, and there's a P-38, 263 feet down in Greenland under the ice. And they took it apart piece by piece and brought it up through that shaft. They rebuilt it in Middleborough, Kentucky, and it flies, as far as I know, still today. They renamed it Glacier Girl. So 263 feet, 48 years, again, the first time they found it, 50 years when they finally pulled it up out of there. I think it was 268 feet when they finally did pull it up out of there, 263 feet when they found it in 1990. So in that, melting that down, that 263 feet, hundreds of those light rings, dark rings. Depending on what estimate you use, what expert, right? Some fart smeller, smart feller calculates that up, right? And says, well, that amount of distance, that number of rings is probably 3,000 years. But it was 48 to 50 years, right? It's not annual rings. And so that's how they come up with hundreds of thousands of years in that snow. It's not that long. We know exactly when it happened. You can't have snow underneath a flood, can you? What's going to happen to it? It's going to float up. If there was any before, which I don't think there was, it's going to float up, right? It's going to melt. So there wasn't any. So it all started, right? The Ice Age started right at the end of the flood, by the flood. The mechanism of the end of the flood, the mountains rising up, is what triggered everything and allowed the ocean level to drop and allowed the animals and the people to spread out. Again, we'll look next week about the Tower of Babel and look at those different people groups and how they all tie together ultimately. So, very interesting. Again, very quick overview of that. There's a whole lot more information on there. If it interests you at all, I encourage you guys to study it. It's very interesting stuff. But there's no problem at all with explaining. Again, tonight, not a lot of biblical stuff, but it's stuff that ties into the Bible. So let's stand tonight. We'll dismiss in prayer. Dear Father, we're grateful to gather here. Lord, we don't need all this to know the Bible. But Lord, it's neat to study. It's neat to be able to look through the biblical glasses and to see our world and see things around us, and it just proclaims your glory. It proclaims the truth of your word, Lord. It just builds our faith even stronger. And I know that faith is greatly blessed by not seeing, but by seeing, it's wonderful to see these things and to understand these things. It's wonderful that we can teach our young people, Lord, that they don't have to be sold out to the ideas and the viewpoints of this world. Your word says, professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. Your word says that they are willingly ignorant. They're dumb on purpose, is what your Bible says. Your word says to us. They're willingly ignorant. They know better. And there's so many scientists out there that have a biblical worldview, and they see it the same way we do. But those that don't want to see it that way, they don't want to accept that you're God, they don't want to accept that there's a judgment coming, they try to come up with all kinds of crazy reasons that don't make sense at all. Lord, just help all of our young people not to buy into those crazy thoughts, just to read your word and believe your word and trust in you in all things. Lord, lead us and guide us as we leave here tonight and head off into the rest of our week. We love you, and we ask all these things in the name of Jesus. And everybody said, amen. All right, have a good rest of y'all's week. And again, I'll try to get that faith note straightened out. But next week's lesson is back there. It's very similar to what you have here tonight.